Okay, we can be seated. Go ahead. Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, right before the break, we had introduced number 389 and 390 into evidence in the court submission. Published 389. Go ahead. Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Kurtzman, is this one of the photographs that you took at the time you did your analysis?
Yes, it is.
And what's the significance of what we see in 389?
So this is the right zygomatic arch, which we talked about earlier, which had the linear defects. And we can see one linear defect here. And then we can see another defect here that, in my opinion, was altered by a casting process that had taken place before I had a chance to examine the skull. And so this looks different when compared to the previous photos that we looked at. And the first defect, which I first described, the one which is a little bit more posterior, retains its characteristics where it's parallel, V-shaped, apex curve, and again, tangential to the bone surface. In this portion of the bone, what is exposed is the cut surface of the bone. So where a sharp-edged instrument would have cut through the bone, the small portion of tissue, or bone, that was lifted away, in my opinion, was present on the previous photograph that we looked at. Again, in my opinion, this flake of bone was lifted off once the casting material was removed. And that would partially underscore the concept of a post-mortem artifact as opposed to a perimortem artifact. Because perimortem, so recently after death, the bone is still moist, it retains its elasticity, it can bend, and you can cut bone with a knife. And so the bone was cut, and a portion of the bone that was lifted off was still present on the bone when Dr. France first documented and photographed the specimen, but then it was casted. This is a delicate flake of bone that's now dried and brittle, and it just snapped off. It would have just snapped off. You're welcome.
So Dr. Kurtzman, we're going to break that down a little bit. You were aware that the photographs we were just looking at prior to this, prior to the break, were taken by Dr. France, right?
That's correct.
And she took those photographs before she did the casting or molding process.
That's correct.
And then after the photographs were taken and the documentation was collected, she then tried this casting process.
That's correct.
And you believe the casting process had an impact on what you later observed in November of 2017.
That's correct.
What was the difference between what you looked at in the photographs and what we see in 389?
The only difference, again, in my opinion, there's a small flake of bone that has been removed. It does not change my opinion about the pattern of the injury and its significance. The
difference, I think you were just hitting on how this reflected, the change, reflected a post-mortem change.
Correct.
Can you explain that, please?
Again, bone in somebody who is alive is elastic. It's a tissue. It's not as soft as soft tissue, but it does have some elasticity. Our bones are constantly changing, and they have to have some change in order to constantly remodel and age. If a bone sustains a sharp force injury, or a fracture. It's flexible. So it will initially be sort of elastic and bendy, and then at some point in time, it'll reach a more plastic stage where you bend it and it retains that stage. And then you go on to further application of force, and then that will cause a fracture. In the case of the knife is basically shaving off this connective tissue, this collagen, which happens to be impregnated with hydroxyapatite, which is the calcium and the phosphate. So that makes it hard, but it still maintains the elastic quality. That's why you can cut a bone and have a small flap of bone that lifts it up. When the bone is dry, so it no longer has any moisture content, it is desiccated. And or if it loses any of that collagen content and it retains only the mineral content, it's hard and it's brittle. It's like a piece of ceramic. It has no flexibility whatsoever. And so in that case, we've got this now tiny little flap of bone, which at one point in time was flexible and elastic, but it no longer is, because it's clearly post-mortem. It's dried, it's desiccated, and because it's a small piece of bone, and if you apply casting material over the top, it may break that off.
So fair to say the cuts are perimortem caused by sharp force injury, but the change between Dr. France's photos, casting, and your examination reflect a post-mortem change in how that would look on the bone.
That's correct.
And specifically, what changes did you identify in the cuts themselves, or what differences did you see from the photos that Dr. France took and when you examined the cranium of Dylan Redwine?
So again, with the photograph that Dr. France took, the small piece of bone is covering the surface here. So you can see what looks like kind of a divot. And there's a flat surface, which is, the surface that has been incised. So I'm going to change my position here. So a knife blade, so just for the purpose of demonstration, now I'm standing on the right side of the photograph. I've got my pointer, and I am moving my pointer. So this would be the back of the skull, this is the front of the skull. I'm moving my pointer from back to front, and it would be tangential to the bone surface. So it's shaving and slicing the piece of bone off. And the only difference between the photograph that Dr. France has and the photograph that I made is that this small chip of bone, which was concealing the surface, is now removed. So this is actually, in some ways, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but in this case, it did demonstrate a cut surface.
And what effect, if any, did the casting process have on your expert opinion in this case?
It did that. I didn't agree with the casting process being done before everybody had had a chance to look at it, because it altered it, but it didn't hurt anything from my perspective, in terms of my opinion.
We're going to go to 390.
Same photograph with slightly different lighting. So I used the blue lighting in the photograph before, and you can see the cut mark. And then there's a more direct lighting that doesn't show the second cut mark as well.
And that leads to my next question. Is it, as we look at different photos, does it also change based on the type of lighting, type of camera, angle of photograph, and so on?
Absolutely.
Doctor, you can have a seat. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you've already testified that these marks, in your expert opinion, were caused by a sharp force object. And you touched on some of the differences between these and what you would see in Scavengers. And I'm just hoping that we could use an example for the jury. I'm going to put 375 on the screen. In 375, which is on the screen, Doctor, do you see any examples of a bite mark or post-mortem predation?
Yes, I do.
Of course, willing to allow you to step down, I would ask you to do so. Go ahead. Thank you, Your Honor.
What I'd like to do is I'd like to magnify this picture, but first I'll draw your attention to, and this is a photograph that's depicting the inside of the cranium. So what would be next to the brain? This is the left side of the head. This is the right side of the head. This is the front side. And so we can see the defect in the top left portion of the photograph, which I'm pointing to. And if we, perfect, thank you very much. So what we can see when we take a look at this is that it's sort of a round, sort of an oval defect. But you can see that there are cracks, linear defects around that defect. And, you know, we talk about bone in the skull. There's a flat surface, a compact bone on the outside. There's the middle portion, which is trabecular bone, which is more soft bone. And then on the inner table, we have that compact bone surface. And so when force is applied to the outer table or the inner table of the bone, that cortical surface may break. And when it breaks, if it's flexible, as you can see in a perimortem state where somebody who's alive, the bone will bend and crack. And so that's what it's done here. And so this is consistent with post-mortem predation. So a tooth is generally, a canine tooth is generally round or oval in its cross-sectional contour. And so you could expect to see a defect like that. Alternatively, it could be anything that's round, so it could be potentially the instrument that causes that defect. I would say more likely this is probably post-mortem predation, but bottom line is it's a perimortem defect. And I'll compare that. So there's a hole up here you can take a look at. And if you take a look at that hole, that would be a foramen, which is a anatomical term for a hole in bone through which blood vessels, sometimes nerves, arteries may pass through. If you take a look at that, the characteristics of this hole are different than this defect. These are smooth, these are rounded. It's not associated with trauma whatsoever. It's just a normal finding that you would see.
So the marks that we focused in on here that you've been talking to the jury about reflect, in your opinion, post-mortem predation.
Correct. It would be, I would say, it's most probable that it is post-mortem predation. It couldn't exclude with 100% certainty some type of mechanical defect, but more likely post-mortem predation.
And then here we have the perimortem skull fracture on the right side of the cranium.
That's correct. And so that's this irregular line. And I'll just point out, this looks like a ridge running down the middle. This is just normal anatomic structure. This is the frontal bone.
And I say right because I'm thinking about looking at the picture, but that's actually the left front.
It's the left frontal bone.
Now, Doctor, you can have a seat. Thank you. I'll take 375 down. Have you had, sorry, I'll wait for it. Have you had the opportunity to look at scavenger marks on bones during the course of your career?
Many times.
When you say many, give the jury a feel for how many times you've seen scavenger marks on bones that you've examined during the course of your medical career.
Hundreds of times. Beginning with my first exposure to death investigation at the medical examiner's office beginning in 1983, we would receive skeletonized remains, and those were skeletonized remains in a variety of situations: homicide, accident, suicide, natural deaths. And I've continued that through to today. And we regularly respond to scenes. We will oftentimes work with forensic anthropologists as a part of the team. And we're typically engaged in the processing of remains that are not completely skeletonized. So as an example, if an individual has sustained a significant injury that we know has affected the bone, oftentimes what we will do is remove the tissue to expose the bone and then look at the bone surface to provide better characterization of the characteristics of the mark that are present. And so when we talk about characteristics, you can talk about class characteristics. If you use a saw blade, saw blades have different types of patterns, and you can see that in bone. And you can distinguish different classes. So a sharp force injury, like an incised wound, is different than a mark that's made with a saw. And then within each class,
and Judge, I'm going to object to this portion of the testimony. It's going beyond what he's been qualified as an expert on. He has not been qualified in tool mark analysis. Tool mark analysis.
Well, I'm not sure this is tool mark analysis. He's a forensic pathologist. He's qualified to talk about manner and cause of death and what causes it. And he's also talked about his previous study in bone pathology. I don't remember exactly what the term was. I think he's qualified to do it. So, objections noted. No rule.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So just briefly, whenever we're looking at a case to determine cause and manner of death, if it's traumatic, regardless of if it's accident, suicide, homicide, or otherwise, we want to try to identify the characteristics that are there. And so we do make a great effort to look at that and document that. And that can be with regular photography. It can be with photography using a dissecting microscope. It can be facilitated with electron microscopy. Sometimes it can be facilitated with high-resolution computerized tomography or CT scans. And so essentially we're trying to document and preserve that information.
You've seen hundreds of cases involving scavenger marks. How do these cut marks differ from those?
Scavenger marks, again, have a different pattern. If you're looking at a rodent with chisel-shaped teeth, it is typically a flat, excoriated portion of the bone. If you are looking at something like a bear or a coyote or a wolf or a fox, they have canine teeth. And so the canine teeth are pointy, but again, not coming to a perfect apex. They're slightly rounded at the edge. And you could say the same thing for claw marks. Although claw marks, typically, if you look at claws are made of keratin. Keratin is the same thing that makes up our nails, makes up our hair, not as hard as bone. So teeth, because they also contain hydroxyapatite, that makes it really hard, that can easily score or damage the bone surface.
Doctor, I'm sorry. I have another question for you. Based on your examination and analysis, what did you conclude about Dr. France's identification of these as cut marks consistent with sharp force injury?
Specifically on the zygoma, I absolutely agree. There were a couple of marks on the skull which I questioned as being possibly cut marks, but was not able to ascertain that with certainty.
For the ones that you've testified about here and the ones that you looked at from Dr. France, do you say that with absolute certainty as to those?
I'm very confident that those are cut marks.
one moment, Your Honor. So after examining injury, the skull fracture consistent with blunt force trauma and the sharp force injuries you've talked about here, you declared this a homicide with cause undetermined?
Correct. I provided an opinion that I felt that this was a homicide, and I was not able to determine the exact cause of death.
What is the reason you can't determine the exact cause of death, Dr. Kurtzman?
I don't have any of the organs to look at in terms of any effect that the fracture, which I consider perimortem, more likely associated with an injury as opposed to post-mortem predation. But I don't know what effect it had on the brain or its coverings. With regard to the sharp force injury, the same thing could be said there. And then the other part is that most of the remains are absent, so I can't tell you what was present on the neck. I can't tell you if there was any injury sustained to the chest. And if there was injury sustained to the chest, was there damage to the heart or to the lungs or to the abdomen? If it was the liver, if it was a stab wound or a gunshot wound or blunt force injury, I just don't have that. And so for me to try to render an opinion that would provide an explicit cause of death would be ludicrous, because I just can't say that the cause of death is known. The only thing that I know with reasonable certainty is that this has a perimortem fracture on the skull and that there are cut marks on the skull.
And is the reason cause of death is difficult or impossible to determine because of the manner in which Dylan's body was disposed of?
Predation, Judge. And assumes facts, not
The
evidence.
objection is to the disposed of, correct?
Absolutely.
All right. Can you phrase it a different way?
Sure. Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Kurtzman, is it fair to say that since very few remains of Dylan Redwine were recovered, it resulted in some of the evidence that you could have gathered from his body being destroyed or removed?
Sure. More importantly is we know that Dylan's remains were discovered up on the mountain. And of course they were skeletonized remains. It's not natural in any way to have skeletonized remains with cut marks found in an open environment. It doesn't happen in nature. Bears don't carry knives. Coyotes don't carry knives. Birds of prey that might pick on things, they don't carry knives. It's not an injury that's associated with post-mortem predation.
Your Honor, I have nothing further. Doctor, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Bogan?
Yes, please. Doctor, it sounds like you got involved in this case briefly in 2013 with a viewing of the post-cranial remains. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And when I say post-cranial and you say post-cranial, what we're talking about is remains beneath the head, correct?
That's correct.
Under the head. Cranium, head, post-cranial, everything below, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then after that viewing, you did a more thorough analysis and wrote a report, a letter, if you will, to Lieutenant Azell, in 2017, correct?
That is correct.
And that was in November 2017, right?
That's when I did the examination. That's correct.
Right. And that's when you did the examination of the skeletal remains, right?
Correct. So all of the remains that I saw in 2013 were present for me to view once again, with the exception that the cranium was not present when I first viewed the remains in 2013 because it had not yet been discovered. So I had a chance to look at the cranium and all of the other bones.
And your examination of the remains in 2017, that was done at the behest of the district attorney's office, correct?
That is correct.
And that was 2 years after the cranium was found, correct?
That is correct.
And that was at least 4 years after the post-cranial remains were found, correct?
That is correct.
And that was after Mr. Mark Redwine had been indicted, correct?
That is correct.
And you talked about the materials you relied upon in informing your opinion as to cause and manner of death, and I want to revisit that. As you testified to, one of the items that you relied upon in your report, in your analysis, informing your opinion, was Dr. France's report from 2015, correct?
Oh, that is correct.
And that included the report and all the photos that you looked at associated with that report taken by Dr. France, right?
Correct, although I'll add one point of clarification. There are photographs that are included in Dr. France's report, and those are the photographs that I looked at. So if there were additional photographs that Dr. France had, I did not view those prior to preparing my report.
And as you testified, you also relied on a map of Middle Mountain with distance deemed relevant to the death investigation, correct?
That is correct.
And that map and those distances were put together by law enforcement, correct?
That is correct. Or at least I believe that they were.
And you also relied on the probable cause affidavit regarding the extradition of Mark Redwine, correct?
I read that.
Right. You read that, and you listed it as one of the things that you relied upon in forming your opinions here, correct?
Correct.
And that's another document that was drafted by law enforcement, correct?
That is correct.
You said you relied on a timeline of electronic devices.
That is correct.
And that was a document that was prepared by law enforcement.
That is correct.
You also relied on something that you identified as work product authored by Jim Ezell and Antonio Goldbright. Obviously, that was prepared by law enforcement as well.
Correct.
And you relied on a drawing of the first floor and a drawing of the second floor of Mr. Redwine's house, right?
Oh, that is correct.
And those diagrams were produced by law enforcement.
That is correct.
As were the photographs of luminol that you relied upon in your report.
That is correct.
And the photographs of the white Dodge truck, those were taken by law enforcement as well.
That is correct.
And a chart of skeletal and personal items of Dylan Redwine, that was prepared by law enforcement, correct?
That is correct.
And last item you relied upon was an email from law enforcement as well, correct?
That is correct.
So out of the 12 things you relied upon in your opinion, one of them was the report of another doctor, Dr. France. 10 of them were prepared by law enforcement, and the other thing you relied upon in your analysis was your own examination of the remains, correct?
That's correct. And if I may, with any case that
I think you answered my question. I don't know if this drifts into the whole truth, but I think you've answered my question, Judge. And I say that sincerely. I'm not trying to be a pill.
Well, it's, you can follow it up on cross-examination.
On redirect, Your Honor?
Redirect, excuse me, redirect.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Permission to approach with defense 1748, 1749, 1750, 1752, 1755, 1756, 1757, 2 of those, 1761, 1766, 1769.
Let me catch up with you just a second. You may.
Your Honor,
Yes.
if I may,
Yes.
just to expedite things, these are all photographs from Dr. France's report. The prosecution's provided to the defense previously. Some, perhaps many of them are already in evidence, but in an effort to expedite everything, the people would stipulate to the admission of any photographs that are actually used during the examination of Dr. Kurtzman.
All right. So 17, 48, 49, 50, 52, 55, 56, 57, 61, 66, and 69 are admitted. Go ahead, Mr. Logan.
Doctor, these are the photos from Dr. France's report that you said you relied upon amongst all the other items informing your opinion. Please familiarize yourself with those, and we'll talk about them.
So defense exhibit 1748 shows the front of the cranium.
I'm not asking you to test, I'm just asking you to get familiar with them.
Oh, okay.
Thank
I'm sorry.
Now, before we get into the photos,
Hold on just a second, would you? Go ahead and finish up there. There's a lot of them there. Okay, go ahead.
before we get into the photos, the report that you relied upon, drafted by Dr. France, noted that there were many fractures on the edge of the segment, many of which can be most conservatively explained by scavenging, correct?
It can be scavenging. It could be perimortem injury. I can't state with certainty.
Right. But the report that you relied upon, Dr. Francis said, they can most conservatively be explained by scavenging, referring to the fractures on the edges of the segment, meaning the cranium, correct?
Your Honor, I asked and answered. I think Dr. Kurtzman just answered the question.
I don't think he did. That's why I had to ask it again.
No, I thought he did, but you can answer again.
So essentially, the information that's contained in Dr. France's report is Dr. France's opinion. And as a forensic pathologist, I like to form my own opinion based upon what I see and observe. And so Mr. Bogan is absolutely correct. I did rely on these pieces of information to look at, but I'm forming my own opinion based on the content. So I may or may not, I may or may not agree with everything that's contained.
And moving on to the photographs, I want to show you a couple here. I'm going to ask to publish (1748) and 1749.
Go ahead. You may as well just keep that till you're done. It'll be faster. Yeah. Okay.
I won't take it with me.
Well, don't do that. That'd be a problem for us.
Now, Doctor, if we look on the left, that's one of the photos that you already testified about today and was included in Dr. France's report, correct?
Correct.
And what that shows is the fracture on the left side of the frontal bone, and Dr. France even put an arrow there, correct?
That's correct.
And when I say left side of the frontal bone, that means left side of the frontal bone, not the viewer's left, right?
That's correct. Left side of the decedent's face or forehead.
And we can see the other side of that fracture in the other photo, which Dr. France labeled as figure 11, correct?
That is correct.
And can you point that out to the jury? Okay. And then also on figure 11, we can see that the puncture marks, what you were talking about just a few moments ago, where they are in relation to that fracture on the inside, right?
That's correct. It's on the opposite side.
And using your medical expertise,
Sure.
can you show approximately on the outside of the cranium on figure 1 where those puncture marks would be? Is that something you're comfortable doing?
Sure. It'd be right in this area. So this hole right here, see right there?
And that's a naturally occurring hole we know as a foramen, correct?
Correct. That's natural occurrence. That is this hole. So this defect is right about here, on the right side.
And I think this will go faster if I can approach, Judge.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll share the microphone with you.
I'll speak loud. How's that? Please explain to the jury what this process is right here and what it connects to on a healthy cranium.
So that's the anterior portion of the zygomatic arch. And so it goes back and forth between the two. And part of it's broken away.
And when you say anterior, you mean towards the front, right?
That's correct. So anterior is the front of the body. Superior is the top. Inferior is below. And posterior is behind, if I use those terms.
And when we're talking about the zygomatic arch, anterior, you've already been done once, right? You tell me where I'm pointing in the wrong place. The anterior part of the zygomatic arch, you said, is kind of your upper cheekbone, correct?
Correct. May I approach you, Mr. Bogan?
By all.
Would you mind moving your glasses? So the zygomatic arch is going from, so this little bump is called the tragus, and it goes all the way up that way. So it's an arch. It's an extension off the temporal bone.
And if I ask the record to reflect that you were basically running your finger, the area between kind of my right eye and my right ear, that's generally where that arch is.
That's correct.
And we see the inferior portion of that arch right there, right, on the left side of the figure 1 on the left.
That is correct.
And we can also see it right here as well, right?
Correct.
And is there any way you can estimate the distance between those punctures, those bite marks, and the fracture?
When we say bite marks, the only thing we've looked at is this specific bite mark.
By all means.
Singular. And so in terms of the distance, let's see, so maybe a couple of inches. Hard to say. I don't know exactly what plane this is, this measuring device is.
Okay.
So if it's farther behind, it's going to have a difference on the interpretation of the distance. Or, if it's closer, then that would also have an impression. But if we were to just use this as a single standard, what is it worth? We're looking at this bottom part as a ½ inch. And so, say that's a ½ inch. And if we assume that the bite mark is someplace over here, because that's that foramen, so we've got, let's say, 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1.5 inches, understanding that this was curving away from the plane. So I don't know exactly how far, but let's say
Give or take 1.5 inches on the fly in court with a lawyer asking you to figure this out.
Sure.
I'm going to ask to publish $17.50, $52.
You can publish all of these. Just
Thank
go
you.
ahead and do it.
Thank you. You testified about this diagram, and it was also, or this photograph, and it's also a photograph on Dr. France's report, correct?
Mr. Doherty, I have to apologize, you have your name. Michael, he published a different photograph. This photograph, I looked at earlier, but I asked not to use that photograph because there's discoloration on the surface of the cranium. And this is the fracture, which is actually in front of or anterior to, not this dark area.
And you testified about this fracture, and let's do some more anatomy here real quick. The suture on the left side of the photograph is the coronal suture, right?
That's correct.
Naturally occurring phenomena in just about everyone, right?
That's correct.
Where the two bones kind of fuse together.
That's correct. And what happens is that when you think of the skull, it's not one bone. It's actually formed by many different bones that actually grow together. And so at those intersections where the bones grow together, it forms a suture. And that's that irregular spot there. And sutures are frequently a point of weakness for the bone.
And that's kind of my next point. I believe during direct, you described this as a diastatic fracture, correct?
That's correct.
And break that down for us in layperson terms one more time, please.
So when we were looking at the linear fracture through the frontal bone, that was coursing through bone, not involving a suture. If forces are applied to the cranium and those forces incorporate where a suture is located, since that's a point of weakness to start off with already, it's more easy to develop a fracture through that location. And so it would be considered a diastatic fracture. Sometimes it's completely separated. And so you might see, for some people, this would be completely broken off.
Weaker part of the cranium is the suture, right? If I understand you correctly.
Correct.
And these sutures are a naturally occurring phenomena that get stronger as people get older, correct?
They tend to be, they never really obliterate completely, but they become less defined. So when you start off as a baby, when they're young, they're wider. And then as you get older, they get narrower and narrower and narrower, almost to the point where you can't perceive them anymore.
And safe to say, a child or an adolescent sutures are going to be less strong than an adult's, correct?
I mean, to some extent. I mean, your skeleton is maturing up until your 20s. And he's 13, so he's an adolescent.
So that's going to be a less strong suture than in a full-grown adult male.
Correct. And the bone is not as robust, it's not as thick.
And any fracture is going to follow the point of least resistance, weakest part of the bone, right? That's where a fracture, that's how a fracture travels, correct?
Correct. And it also is in part dependent on how the force is applied. So when a force is applied, there'll be vector forces that will propagate in different directions. And so there's a variety of different mechanisms that might be produced to see different types of fractures.
And you described another kind of fracture. and I didn't catch the name of it, but you said it's what occurs when someone gets hit by a hammer or something and it causes a dent, or I would assume some sort of like almost spider web pattern in a cranium.
Correct. So I call that a depressed skull fracture. And so a depressed skull fracture would be, again, either an individual falling and striking their head on a hard surface, and or being struck in the head with something that's hard. And so depending on the characteristics of that surface, so if it happens to be round like a ball peen hammer, it may be concentrated in there. If it is like a roofing hammer where it's flat and round, you might see depression that looks like that. If it's a baseball bat, then something that's elongated, or maybe if there's a steel rod like my pointer here, somebody got hit with a steel rod, that could produce a depressed skull fracture.
Baseball bat, steel rod, hammer. We could probably spend the rest of the afternoon listing the implements that could cause a depression fracture.
That's correct.
Okay. And you didn't see any depression fractures on any of the elements in these remains, correct?
Correct. Again, albeit that we only have a portion of the range. So what's here, I didn't see any depressed skull fracture.
And is this one, this is a close-up of the same fracture to the coronal suture, right? Does that give everyone a better idea of what we're talking about here?
Correct. And that's a better picture because the arrow's pointing to the extension along the suture, not this area of pigmentation.
These are also photos that were included in Dr. France's report as well, correct?
That's correct.
And
Yes.
And what we know from your own observations and from Dr. France's report is that there's animal scavenging marks in figure 10 here, the superior part of the cranium, correct?
Correct.
And when we're talking superior, that's the top, right? Can you point those out to the jury, please?
So it's these linear striations that you see on the top of the head. So this would be the top left side of the head.
And there's similar striations like that on the posterior as well, correct?
There are. I've seen them in the photographs. At least in this form of presentation, it's more difficult to see. So linear defects like this, maybe this. It's better when I'm looking at something that's printed. Printed. And the reason being is that if you look at a screen like this, it's projected light. And the resolution that you see with a screen like this is not as great as the resolution that you would see on a printed piece of paper. On a printed piece of paper, it's usually 300 dots per inch. So it's very, very fine detail. If you were to look at a photo that's printed in a newspaper, for instance, the resolution is not as great, so it looks kind of grainy. And so, yes, there are striations that are consistent with post-mortem predation in these photographs. If you look at the photographs, we can't as easily point them out in this method of presentation.
And you can have a seat for a while. I'm going to take that down. Now, one of your observations of the cranium when you wrote your report was that it had been subject to a casting process, right?
That's correct.
And you even noted that the effects that casting process had on the cranium. You mentioned at least one of them during direct.
That's correct.
And we'll get to that in a moment. But another issue that you spotted was the fact that there had been residual casting material left on the cranium, correct?
That's correct.
And explain to the jury what that means.
Some of the casting material is adherent, and it remains on the surface of the cranium as opposed to coming away with the cast.
And how did you know that you were looking at casting material and not bone or dirt or something like that?
The appearance to me was not something that I would expect to see in nature or in an environment where there's, I'll say forest floor material, that duff that covers on a forest floor. You could see bark, you could see leaves, you could see dirt. This material was adherent to the surface, and it was white, and it had the characteristics that I commonly associate with some types of casting material.
And I'm going to ask to approach with defendants 1794.
You may. And this can be admitted?
Sorry, Your Honor, I haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
Yes, Your Honor, this is one of the photos that the prosecution provided, and I stipulated to its submission to move things along.
1794 is admitted.
Thank you.
Is that one of the photos you took of the cranium during your November 22nd, 2017 examination?
Yes, it is.
And can you see some casting material in the cranium there?
Correct. There's material there which I would categorize as casting material.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to stand up and point the casting material out to the jury, please.
If you take a look at the bone surface, you can see bright white areas. There's actually some little flecks of blue, little flecks of red, and those are deposited in areas where the bone surface is not smooth and even. So in areas where the bone is smooth and even, the casting material has not adhered. However, in other areas, so we can see some areas that are consistent with post-mortem predation. There are some defects here which I question the possibility as possibly a sharp force defect, but I can't really render that opinion because it's in part covered with casting material, and in part, at least in this photograph as published, I can't see the surface characteristic as well.
And while we're on the topic of that, Mark, you cannot say with any scientific certainty that that's a tool mark or can be attributed to a man-made device.
No, I would not be able to state that with certainty.
In fact, you even said it's inconclusive in your own report, correct?
Correct.
Permission to approach and publish 1768.
You may approach.
Your Honor, the people stipulate to the admission of 1768.
1768 is admitted.
Can you point out any casting material in this? Can you point out any casting material in 1768 as well.
Once again, I would just point out the areas that appear bright, they're punctate or somewhat linear, along areas that have some striations.
One seven nine six. Admission and publication.
People stipulate on 1796, Your Honor. Thank you.
Submitted.
Now, in this one, describe to the jury what side of the cranium we're looking at.
This is the right side of the cranium, so the right side of the decedent's head. And here's the external auditory canal or meatus, and that is filled with casting material.
And if I blow it up, does that make it easier to see?
Correct. And if you wanted to refer back to the other photographs, which had no casting material, you could see that that's a dark hole.
Right.
You can see now that it's filled.
So describe for the jury where on the cranium you observed this casting material getting stuck, generally speaking.
On the surfaces, mostly around the front, and on the right side of the ear, on the zygomatic arch. And when I say zygomatic, right zygomatic arch, where I interpreted the defects as being cut marks.
1798 for admission and publication.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor. And if all these pictures are from Dr. Kurtzman's examination and the prosecution provided to the defense, we're not going to object to any of these coming as evidence, just to move the process along.
1798 submitted.
And show the jury on yourself what we're looking at here again, as far as right zygomatic root and all that.
So this is it's blurry here because it's not in the same plane of focus, but this is the right external auditory canal or meatus, and that's filled with casting material. And then this is the right zygomatic arch, and then this is the cut. This is the other cut, and we can see white particulate matter on the edge of the zygomatic, which is interrupted.
And I'm zooming in on that. When you say white particulate matter, we're talking about casting material there, correct?
That's how I would interpret that, yes.
Okay. And can you point that out now that we've zoomed in on it a little bit? Right. Have a seat. Seeking to publish and introduce by stipulation 1775.
Submitted.
want to talk about the differences you observed in the zygomatic arch that you photographed and how those differed from the photographs you saw in Dr. Francis' report. To do that, I'm going to publish 1775 and figure 8 from Dr. Francis' report, already admitted by stipulation 1761. Haven't asked a question yet.
I won't say anything.
Safe to say Dr. Francis' photo from the report is on the viewer's left, correct?
That's correct.
And we see the two marks here and here, moving from left to right, or posterior to anterior down the arm.
So if we're looking at the side of the person's head, the defect here on the lower right is more anterior, and it's the front. So we're moving from front to back to the second defect.
And on the right side,
Same thing.
Is the photo you took, right?
Right. So this defect that I'm pointing to, which is the more posterior, is the same as the one that's more to the left. And this defect, which again I believe has been altered, is this defect here. And what I believe took place is, again, this, in my opinion, is a sharp force injury tangent to the bone surface, so it's a shaved portion of bone away from the cortex. But it has not been disrupted, hasn't been taken off. In this photograph, I believe that the flake of bone has been partially shaved off, has snapped off.
Safe to say, what we're talking about here, when we look at the top of Dr. Francis' photograph, it's kind of a semicircle in this photograph. It's same here in this one, correct?
Objection, Your Honor.
Wait. Objection?
Okay.
The counsel's question about just not here, I think counsel's starting to testify, and he should be asking a question of Dr. Kurtzman.
I think that's right. So watch it in the future, but, well, actually, this is cross-examination, right? I think he can ask leading questions, which I think is allowed, so.
Your Honor,
I think it's a lead.
To me, it's a leading question more than what was happening earlier today.
okay.
And Your Honor, I believe I can answer the question.
You can now.
Well, let me ask you about that.
Sure.
You have what appears to be a semicircle here on the right mark, correct?
Correct.
And there's not a feature like that on the right mark here, correct?
That's correct, and there's a reason for that.
I think both of them, but
This is a curved surface, and so this is a distinctly linear marking to me. And so even though this appears as a curve, it's just a cut of the contour that the sharp force is applied to. So if I were to, we don't have an apple here. If I were to cut an apple, not in half, but if I were to shave a portion of that apple off, and if I were to look at that cut perpendicular to that shave, it would recur. So I don't doubt for a moment, as Mr. Bogan has said, this looks like a curve. But in my opinion, it is tangential. It is a straight, sharp portion.
But you do agree, and you've testified several times today, that a portion of the bone there on the second mark is gone.
Correct.
In your opinion.
Exactly.
And in your opinion, it flaked off, correct?
That's correct.
And can we move on from this now? It's about, I don't know how many times we've done this.
I'd have to look at the term.
Well, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you we're moving on.
Go ahead and have a seat.
Sure. Thank you.
And without talking about the comparison, I do want to ask a couple follow-up questions regarding, in your opinion, the causation of that part of the bone being missing.
Correct.
And what you testified to today is that you believe that molding process is consistent with a post-mortem defect, post-mortem injury, with the bone flaking, snapping off, correct?
That is correct.
And as we all know, you wrote a report in this case, correct?
That's correct.
And you knew this was the Dylan Redwine case, and you knew that Lieutenant Dizelle had asked you for this information, right?
Yeah, let's just move on. You don't need to do that, okay?
Nowhere in your report does it say that that missing bone can be attributed to a post-mortem injury from molding, correct?
I don't recall specifically. I'd have to refresh my memory by looking at the report. I believe I have it worded there.
I respectfully turn your attention to page 2 of your report. Full paragraph, first one.
So I did comment that one defect, right zygoma, appeared altered from photographs published in the anthropology report prepared by Dr. Diane France. And so that would be essentially saying the same thing, that it's different than when she had it in the photographs that she first made prior to any casting attempts.
But your report does not attribute that missing bone to a post-mortem injury. It does not say that in your report that you wrote.
No, I didn't say that.
I want to talk about the process by which you got involved in this case. And you've already testified. It sounds like you came in an official capacity in November of 2017, correct?
That is correct. There was typically forensic pathologists or medical examiners or coroners will render opinions regarding cause and manner of death. And that was the purpose for my being incorporated in the case.
So obviously you weren't involved in this case from the get-go, from when the remains were found, certainly not from when the cranium was found.
Inconsistently. It was never a case that was referred to me by the La Plata County Coroner's Office.
And the case got referred to you when exactly?
There was discussion about the case, again, within a couple of days. Jan Smith, the La Plata County coroner, had indicated to me that bones had been discovered, and she implied to me that she was not in custody of the remains, that there was not anything for me to specifically have as a case to accept. And so I of course, heard about the case at that point in time, but was not directly involved to participate in the direction of how the material would be handled. And then I saw the remains at the college here in town, and then the next time I saw the remains was in November of 2017.
And when you do this sort of examination, you like to get the remains in as pristine as condition as possible, correct?
Correct. But
Explain to the jury why that's important for a forensic pathologist to get the remains in pristine, unaltered condition.
by law, in the state of Colorado, when human remains are discovered that are not part of an anthropologic examination, so we're not looking for Native American or how should I say, indigenous peoples' remains, those remains have to be brought to the attention of the coroner and law enforcement and the medical examiner as appropriate. When that happens, the medical examiner has the opportunity to be a part of that death investigation from the very beginning. And it is common for us to incorporate anthropologists and, in fact, forensic anthropologists. And so that can be used collectively for the determination of cause and manner of death. If it was somebody who was not skeletonized, obviously I would have been involved at the very beginning. In this case, the remains were skeletonized. Dr. Mulhern had had a chance to look at the remains. Dr. France had had a chance to look at the remains. Aside from the casting material, in my opinion, there was nothing different about the remains. You know, at the beginning, ultimately, until I had a chance to see them, again, with the exception of the casting material. Having said that, it has not altered my opinion. I certainly would have handled things differently had I been involved from the very beginning, but it ultimately doesn't change my opinion with regard to cut marks on the zygoma.
And you're aware that after the cranium was found, that Dr. Mulhorn looked at it, and actually you looked at it. No, strike that. After the cranium was found, that Dr. France looked at it. Dr. France looked at it again. It was sent to Texas for DNA, and they cut a piece out of it. It was sent to Quantico for tool mark analysis, and then it arrived for you to analyze after it had been through all those possessions, cleanings, and processes, correct?
Correct. I don't know all the specific details. By November of 2015, I had already moved to, or was in the process of moving to Montana.
And in your professional opinion, Jan Smith, the La Plata County coroner, should have been contacted as soon as these remains were determined not to be human, correct?
Oh, you mean she should have been contacted when it was identified that they were human?
Right.
Yes.
Touché.
Yes.
And in fact, it struck you, in your professional opinion, that the La Plata County Sheriff's Department was in a rush to get these remains identified as human and to get DNA testing as well. That's two questions.
You know, this was a case that involved a missing 13-year-old boy, and there was certainly a urgent desire to confirm the identity of the remains. I'm not sure if I would say rush necessarily. I suppose you could say that urgent and rush equate to the same thing.
Well, you did meet with the Jefferson County Chief Deputy District Attorney and talked about this case.
Objection, Your Honor.
Impeachment. Laying foundation for a prior and consistent statement.
I think that's probably all right, unless you have some different, I'm not sure what your objection is.
Your Honor, I'm objecting because I believe the witness just said urgent and rush equate to the same thing. So if the impeachment's about whether he used the word urgent or rush when he was interviewed 2 years ago, I think we've already covered it, and we would move on.
Is this about that issue? Mr. Bogan? Is this about rush versus urgent?
Absolutely. This is a doctor who's a wordsmith, and
We're moving on.
Thank you, Your Honor.
during your direct testimony, and I'm going to revisit a couple of concepts here before I wrap up for the afternoon. You spoke about one general concept, and that is the concept of perimortem. Remember talking about that a couple hours ago?
Correct.
And as you told this jury, perimortem represents that time that can be before death, during death, or after death, correct?
That's correct.
And you even told this jury that perimortem phase in bones can last days, weeks, months, and you said even years past death, right?
That's correct.
And that's a definition of perimortem, the one that I've just described, and then you affirmed that you share with Dr. France, correct?
I don't know what Dr. France's opinion specifically, but if that's what she said, then yes, I would agree with that.
Would reviewing her report help you refresh your recollection to her definition of perimortem?
I mean, she's testified. They know what she said.
Well,
I mean, what's the point of this?
Well, I'm getting there, Judge, and it has to do with antemortem, perimortem, and postmortem as this witness.
What does the opinion that he needs to look at a report? I mean, they know what she said.
And I'm asking, and one of the things he said on direct, Your Honor, I mean, I don't know if you want to have this at the bench or not.
No, just tell me.
Okay. One of the things he said during his direct testimony is that, and I don't have the exact language here, but he gave a full-throated endorsement of Dr. France's opinions, and I've asked him basically if that extends to her definition of perimortem in the report that you relied upon and reviewed. And he says, I can't remember what her definition is, so I was going to say, how about you look at the report and see?
No. I'm not going to let you do that.
Nonetheless, just to refocus here, we've already talked about what perimortem is. I want to follow up on that. Suppose a forensic anthropologist came into possession of a partial cranium 2 years after it had been missing or left in the wilderness, and that forensic anthropologist said that when she received the partial cranium, it was still in the perimortem phase. Would you trust that forensic anthropologist's opinion as to the state of that cranium?
It would depend on the environment where that cranium was found.
If it was found up in the mountains outside of Durango?
Again, that's the specific location, but it's not entirely talking about the environment. So is it covered with snow? Is it buried? Is it moist? Is it covered with flesh? You know, there's many different variables which will affect whether or not something has a perimortem characteristic or feature.
If Dr. France said that this partial cranium, when she got it...
Objection, Your Honor.
He's been asked about...
Come on.
Excuse me. If Dr. France said the cranium in question in this case was still in the perimortem phase when she received it in November 2015, would that affect at all your analysis of the wounds in this case, in your reference to post-mortem animal predation?
So based on my knowledge of the remains as they were recovered, I would not categorize the condition of the cranium at that stage as perimortem. I would categorize that as postmortem because there's no flesh on the bone. The bone is not not encased in ice. It is, at this point in time, dry and brittle. So at the time of the recovery, I would not describe it as perimortem. I would describe the condition of the cranium at the time that the fracture was sustained and the time of the incised defects on the zygoma as perimortem. And so they could have occurred immediately before death. They could have been sustained right at the time of death, or they might have been sustained immediately after the death, as long as that perimortem condition existed. And so if there's still flesh on the bone, if it is still moist, if it's frozen, it'll essentially be perimortem. It's preserved quite well. But once it starts to change from that, then that's when it's transitioning to clearly the post-mortem stage.
And when you first got to see the cranium, that was in 2017, correct?
That's correct.
And you understand, as you even testified on direct, perimortem is determined by the amount of elasticity and collagen in the bone that makes it bend, as you described, correct?
That's correct.
And how much the bone bends or maintains that elasticity, how much collagen it retains, is going to be dependent on environmental factors, as you just discussed, right?
The condition of the collagen.
Right. And that's what defines perimortem, is the amount of moisture, collagen in the bone, not a timeline, not an environment.
The collagen that's there is the framework upon which the calcium and the phosphorus is deposited, not the hydroxyapatite. And so they're intimately commingled. And over time, the tissue, the connective tissue portion, will dry out and it will be desiccated. And likewise, any moisture that might be present in the calcium or the hydroxyapatite portion, that too. And so it becomes harder and brittle, and it is far less plastic. Can't bend, it's not as elastic as bone that is wet, that has soft tissue on it.
And a perimortem fracture is one that's going to bend before it breaks, correct?
Correct.
Refocusing on the marks on the zygoma. You can't tell this jury what caused those marks. You can't say it was this tool, this instrument, this kind of knife, correct?
By class, I would say that it is a sharp force injury. It is an incised wound. I can't tell you an exact knife that did it. It's a sharp, very narrow apex that comes to a well-defined V at the base, and it has shaved a portion of the bone off, and it's left intact on one of the injuries, the more posterior, and it's chipped off on the more anterior portion.
And you've explained your analysis as to what kind of class you believe this injury is, but you can't say what kind of instrument, what instrument caused those cuts.
Sharp force injury. That's as far as I can go. So I couldn't tell you if it was a double-edged knife. I couldn't tell you if it was a kitchen knife. Couldn't tell you what kind of a knife it is.
And you couldn't say what the width of that knife was.
I would say that it is a narrow width. So let's say like an axe with a chopping mark would have a wider kerf. And a narrower, like a steak knife, would have, excuse me, I think I just made that backwards. So a thick, robust knife would have a wider kerf. A narrow, thin knife would have a pretty slender kerf. This this looks slender to me.
Looks slender, but you didn't measure the width of the marks, correct?
The marks appear in photographic documentation with some measuring scale, so you could look at that.
But you didn't include any measurements in your report.
Objection asked and answered, Anna?
I don't think it was answered.
It wasn't quite answered.
You didn't include any measurements of the width of the cuts in your marks.
No, I didn't describe the length of the cut or the depth of the cut or the specific angle. That's correct.
And aside from saying perimortem, blunt force trauma, you can't identify what instrument or what surface or what caused that fracture to the frontal bone, correct?
That's correct.
You got asked on direct about head injuries and blood. I want to follow up on that. And you listed several different kinds of head injuries. Subdural hematoma, what were the other ones?
So you can go from outside in. You can go to just a simple contusion. You could go to a cephalohematoma. You could go to an epidural hematoma. You could go to a subdural hematoma. If you have a cerebral cortical contusion, typically there's subarachnoid hemorrhage associated with that. And then there's intraparenchymal hemorrhage if it involves the deep structures of the brain. So you can go all the way from both superficial all the way deep into penetrating portions of the brain.
And what are the kinds of those injuries that would produce the most blood?
It just depends on what type of skin defect is present. And so they, with the exception of just a simple contusion, which won't have any blood on the surface, any of those injuries could produce little, none, or lots. It's just, I don't know what, I mean, it's basically, it's hypothetical, and I can't state without knowing what the condition of the skin surface is whether or not it will bleed or not.
Is it generally accepted in medical practice that head injuries tend to bleed a lot?
No. I mean, they do. I mean, there's lots of head injuries that do bleed a lot, but there are closed head injuries that an individual sustains, and when a person sustains a closed head injury, there may not be any defect whatsoever on the scalp or on the head.
And one of the reasons that head injuries will bleed a lot is because, as you said, on direct, the tissue on the head is very vascular, right?
If there's a defect which breaches the skin, so like a laceration, or a cut. So you can have incised wounds on the skin too, and of course they would bleed.
And you testified on direct that one of the things you relied upon in your testimony was photos of where luminol was found in the house, correct?
That's correct. It was reported to me that blood was found in the home.
Did they tell you how many picograms they were talking about?
No, and I wouldn't ask that question.
Sounds like head injuries may bleed a lot, may not bleed a lot, depends on a lot of different factors. If there was a decapitation, I take it that would bleed a lot.
Generally speaking, a decapitation would bleed.
And I bet the same goes for dismemberment. If someone dismembers a body, disarticulates the limbs from the torso, that's going to bleed a lot.
Generally speaking, yes, that would. And if not by active bleeding, just by leaking.
I have one moment, Judge.
Yes.
And you can't say whether the fracture on the frontal bone or the cuts on the zygoma contributed to the death of Dylan Redwine, correct?
Again, I don't know why Dylan died. I can't tell you his cause of death. If Dylan was alive when he sustained the skull fracture, it may not be his cause of death, but it wouldn't be an acceptable form of treatment to fracture someone's skull if they've sustained another injury, or if they've been strangled, or if they've been stabbed, or if they've been shot, or otherwise. Likewise, if a person sustains a sharp force injury and they're still alive at the time that they sustain that sharp force injury, that is not an acceptable form of treatment for any other injury that that person might have sustained. So they would contribute to the cause of death if he was alive at the time that they were sustained. Because there's bleeding. I don't know what type of brain injury, if any, there was associated with that linear skull fracture or that diastatic fracture. I just can't answer because I don't have the brain to look at. I don't have the neuro to look at. I don't have any of the internal organs to look at. So if he was alive when they were sustained, they contributed to his death. If he was deceased at that time, then I would just call them perimortem injuries.
But that's why you put undetermined, because you just don't know how Dylan died.
That's correct. I don't.
Nothing further.
Research? Undetermined for what?
Undetermined for the cause of death, not the manner of death. Manner of death, in my opinion, is clearly homicide. The cause of death, I'll never know.
Just have a few follow-up questions for you.
Sure.
If you were involved in this case from the beginning, would you have asked to have an examination of the cranium, photographs taken, and a forensic anthropologist involved?
Yes, I would.
With regards to counsel's question about dismemberment, someone's dismembered, would the amount of blood that you'd expect be influenced by whether the person was alive or dead for a particular period of time?
So again, this would be contextual. So if a person is dismembered, and if obviously they're going to be deceased at that point there, but they have been dismembered, the blood would leak out during the process of dismemberment. If they're alive, it would be pumped out by the circulation. And so, yes, you would see lots of blood.
So there's a difference if someone cuts off my hand right now as opposed to I'm dead for an hour, I'm dead for 3 hours, and so on.
Right. If you're dead for a period of time and you cut a hand off, it may not have any blood come out at all. Ultimately, what happens is after a person dies, the blood will congeal. There are proteins in the blood. They're clotting proteins. And so after death, even though they may not be actively activated as you would see in an individual who's living, the blood will congeal and it will form a clot. And again, it's not the same thing as what's called an antemortem clot or a clot while a person is alive. It's a very clear distinction, but blood will basically form a loose post-mortem clot after death, and that will limit the way that it flows. A person will dehydrate after death, and so because you're losing moisture, and of course you're losing the fluid content, that also too may affect how blood flows. So not to be obsessive and compulsive in terms of my answer, but if somebody's just been killed and if they just get dismembered, yeah, blood's going to leak out all over the place. If it's been a period of time sufficient for the blood to clot and dehydrated, then you could cut a limb off and it's not going to do anything. Or if it's frozen, it won't do anything.
Dr. Kurtzman, you seem like you wanted to give a more complete answer to the information you looked at in this case, in terms of as a forensic pathologist looking at the background information, the information provided by law enforcement needed to determine your expert opinion in the case. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, that's the information that I would expect of if I was in the medical examiner's office, I would expect the investigator to provide that information for me. If I'm working with a coroner, I would expect the coroner to provide the background information to me, and that would be information that's collected by medical personnel, it would be by law enforcement personnel, it would be by any of a team of people that's necessary to investigate any death. In this particular case, I was not called in to investigate the case specifically by the coroner, and I don't know that I would have accepted at that time just because of everything that had happened. But in this case, I was contacted by the district attorney's office, and I was asked if I would render an opinion about the case. And I agreed that I would render an opinion about the case, and so I asked for the same material that I would normally have expected had I been involved at the very beginning.
And that's my question. Is this the kind of material you would look at normally in reaching your expert opinion as a forensic pathologist?
Exactly. And I would just take that information at face value because I have to form my own opinion. I cannot provide someone else's opinion that I may agree or disagree with. I have to form my own opinion.
So for members of the jury who have not been a part of this process before, not been to autopsies and so on, I'll give you a hypothetical. If a guy is found on a bike path, no bike in sight, you're not simply brought the body, he suffers a closed head wound and he's dead. You're not simply brought the body and told, determine cause and manner, just based on what you find.
I'm not sure if
Let me ask it this way.
Yeah.
In that kind of situation, gentleman found on the bike path, closed head injury, bike is gone, he's deceased.
Correct.
It's your job to determine cause and manner of death.
Correct.
So would you believe it's appropriate, would you normally ask law enforcement to find out, in fact, was he riding a bike? According to his wife, he left the house on his bicycle. And then later, someone is found riding his bike, has his wallet on him, has his debit card on him, has his cell phone on him, has his backpack on him. Those kinds of facts, that kind of information, relevant to you in the normal course of your work?
Those are relevant, but I'm glad that you used that as an example. Just because the guy is found with the guy's bike and with his wallet and everything else doesn't mean that that guy killed the guy on the bike. All it means is that you found a guy who is dead on the ground and his bike is missing and his wallet is missing. That's something that you know unequivocally. If you happen to find the wallet on the other guy and the bike, sure, you know that unequivocally, but you don't know that that other guy killed the man, who was found on the bicycle trail. You have to put together pieces of information to tie that together. I'll give you another perfect example. It was not uncommon in the medical examiner's office in Detroit, and this has happened elsewhere, where an individual is involved in a single vehicle, motor vehicle collision. So they roll over their car. So first responders might get there and they assume, well, it's a motor vehicle collision. Maybe the individual has been ejected. And you would presume, oh, okay, well, they died of injuries sustained in a motor vehicle collision. In Detroit, it was not uncommon for us to find that individuals had been shot before they crashed. And so, it's a homicide. So you can receive that information, but it's always important to do your own examination and you render an opinion based on your findings. So I don't like to work in a vacuum. I like to get that information, but I like to take it for what it's worth and render my own opinion.
That's how you go about your work normally, in terms of the information provided to you that you review.
Correct.
And then you issue and render your own expert opinion.
Correct. And as a medical examiner, I'm not working for the police agencies. I'm not working for the defenders. I'm not working for the prosecution. I am a neutral entity to provide information that can be used by whatever party needs that information.
Doctor, just switching gears for a moment, you had talked about a mark you observed in one of the photos during cross-examination, and counsel described it as inconclusive. Do you recall that?
That's correct.
How did you view that mark when you looked at it?
So I viewed that mark directly, and then I photographed it and, of course, had a chance to magnify it with the photographs. And there were some features there that suggested to me that it could possibly be a sharp force injury, but I didn't have enough objective criteria or sufficient magnification to render an interpretation that was conclusive. And so it was just better for me to say, I don't know. It's inconclusive.
And to be clear, that would be a different sharp force injury than the two that you described here today.
Correct.
Counsel asked you a number of questions about casting, and I just wanted to follow up on that briefly. Would you agree that casting and molding is frequently done in death investigations and forensic work?
Sure, it's common. In many instances, when an individual sustains a blunt force injury and the injury affects bone, sometimes cartilage, or any other portion of the body which will retain the class and maybe individual characteristics of that particular instrument, it's not uncommon to provide casting. And that casting is a permanent record and it can be used for comparison purposes. It was common years ago, not so much today, to look at bite marks. And they used to cast bite marks. Casting is a process that's been in forensic science for years. You can cast like tire tracks, shoe prints, anything that leaves an impression onto a softer surface you can cast.
Whether it's the casting, the transport of the cranium, the different examinations, and so on, anything about that that's altered your view here?
So again, I rendered an opinion that I felt it was the casting. To be honest, I mean, it could be from handling. I don't know that for a fact. I'm assuming that most people who have handled the cranium have been careful. But again, I don't know that with 100% certainty.
And the examination you conducted and the conclusions you reached were also consistent with the photographs taken before the casting, right?
Correct.
Counsel asked you if you can tell specifically what kind of weapon or tool was used to cause the sharp force injuries to Dylan Redwine's cranium.
That's correct.
Any animal, anything in nature that you know of that could have caused those sharp force injuries, Dr. Kurtzman?
In my opinion, no.
Counsel asked you about the perimortem nature of the sharp force injuries and the blunt force trauma. Both of those, when I say both of those, I mean the blunt force trauma and the sharp force injuries. Perimortem in that they were inflicted immediately before, at the time, or immediately after Dylan Redwine's death?
Yes, with the caveat that if that perimortem condition extended out longer. So Dylan disappears in November. It's cold out. If he's covered with snow, if it's moist, it may have extended that period out.
And the perimortem fracture to the left front of Dylan's head, is that consistent with blunt force trauma or bite marks?
It's definitely not a bite mark, but a fracture, a perimortem fracture, can be the consequence of post-mortem predation in some instances. I would say that it is more probable that this is a injury, a perimortem injury, as opposed to post-mortem predation, but I can't state that with 100% certainty. Again, the bone, the front of the cranium, all the facial bones are missing, and in my opinion, it would not be surprising if that were a Lefort type 3 fracture, because you would have essentially dislocation of all the the facial bones from the cranium. And in fact, in most instances where I look at a skull, so somebody who finds skeletal remains, so it could be skeletal remains that have historical interest. So Native American remains that are hundreds of years old sometimes. Usually, more often than not, in my experience from a forensic standpoint, so cases that are brought to me by coroners, usually you'll find most of the cranium intact. Small portions will be up, but usually most of the cranium is there, more often than not, as opposed to one where it's as fragmented as this.
And the Lefort 3 fracture being consistent with, and the fracture we see on Dylan's cranium, blunt force trauma consistent with an object hitting the head forcefully, or the head hitting an object forcefully, or a combination of the two.
Right, it could do that. But again, it's very important for me to be very clear. I cannot exclude post-mortem predation with certainty.
The sharp force injuries, anything about that seems consistent with post-mortem predation to you?
No.
And as a result of all of that, is that why you concluded, in your expert opinion, that this is a homicide in terms of manner of death?
Correct. And also, again, the reported circumstances. Get a 13-year-old boy who's in communication with people, and then suddenly that stops. And there's a report of blood at the residence, which would suggest some type of an injury. And then the remains are ultimately discovered, and there is indication of sharp force injury, which to me is not post-mortem predation. And of course, there's the fracture, which is more probable for me in my interpretation due to an injury as opposed to post-mortem predation. But that part, again, I can't state with certainty.
Okay. I have no further questions for Dr. Kurtzman. Thank you, Doctor.
Any questions from the jury? Can this witness be excused?
Yes, please, Your Honor. Thank you.
By all means.
Okay, you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, we'll break for the day. Again, remember your admonitions. Don't talk to the case either amongst yourselves or with anybody else. Don't initiate, post, or respond to anything about this case on social media. Keep an open mind throughout the trial. Reach a decision only during final deliberations. Do not permit any third person to discuss this case in your presence. If anyone attempts to do so, please report that to me. Don't talk with any witnesses, the defendant, or with any of the lawyers. Don't attempt to gather any information on your own. Do not engage in any outside reading. Do not visit any places mentioned in the case. Do not read about the case in the newspaper. Obtain information about it from the radio, television, internet, social media, or other media source. Do not try and learn about this case outside of the courtroom at all. So with that, thank you. It was kind of a long day, but we'll see you tomorrow. Rise for the jury.